aligned. But as time passed, even those who formed the non-aligned movement, we knew, for example, India, even then it was an aligned state, but it was a founder of the non-aligned movement among the four leaders of the world, Nehru and Sukarno and two others. The non-aligned movement is still alive, still kicking. I think from Venezuela to Pakistan, no, not from Venezuela, the leadership went to Azerbaijan. Today is the head of the non-aligned movement. But there was a challenge to the bipolar world. Not a challenge in any sense, but the fact that we also live. We also want to be recognized. We also have rights. So all conventions which were signed, for example, the Geneva Convention, the first challenge to the world order came about when, starting from Tolstoy, who observed war from close range, personally fighting the Russian war, and then describing the fact and getting bitter about the fact that killing people, and then on one day you raise the white flag and you come out and bury people, and the next day the white flag is down, again you get back to killing people. And from there, a pacifist movement did start, which wanted no war. But at the same time, there was a movement which said there should be a humane war, and which was led by Henry Dunant, for example, who was the founder of the International Red Cross. That was led by him, that there should be laws or humanitarian concerns even while you fight, to be able to treat, how to treat prisoners of war, how to treat injured people, to have ceasefires, etc., etc. And there was a big challenge which has reduced now of pacifists who wanted no war. So a humane war concept is again around today by making it more humane by targeted killings, which were illegal until George Bush made himself a statement, I think in 2001 or 2, he made a statement that when Israel was doing targeted killings, he made a statement that this was illegal. But all things are illegal if the others are doing it. When it comes into your own hands, all legalities have been changed. All Geneva Conventions have been subverted. For example, the human rights issue. Conventions have established the human dignity and human rights. But then countries, for violating the legal understanding of the world, also established Guantanamo Bay, where the prisoners had no human rights, no rights for defense. Even today, the biggest challenge in the world is that my laws protect my countrymen. There are very, very good laws. Some countries have great laws, but they don't protect other people. So the laws are for citizens. The laws are not for the world. So anyhow, what I was trying to mention is, number one, the bipolar world, the world got adjusted to it. But the bipolar world is facing a major challenge. The power base was supposedly with the nation state. But in the last 60, 70 years, after the formation of the United Nations, 75 years or 80 years, after the formation of the United Nations, the power base is going beyond nation state. For example, big politicians appeal to multinationals to give them space, appealing to Twitter to give them space. Prime Minister is looking at Twitter, presidents looking at Twitter, and their judgments are not being made in a democratic manner. Their judgments are being made by their board or by individuals. That's a big challenge. The ability to create violence. In fact, today a Bloomberg report has come out, which I was reading, that the incident of Hindu-Muslim conflict in Leicester, in England, was irritated and inflamed more by about 200 accounts which were on Meta, 200 accounts which were not even from that city. So the fact that these multinational strengths are coming up, but this is not new. You remember, we, the developing world, we, the suffering world, we were the poor world, we thought that one of the reasons why the Middle East was in conflict was because of the natural resources in the Middle East, which was oil. So therefore, the cover given to exploitation from the blatant war, plunder regimes in the medieval ages to the colonial regimes of the 17th and 18th century, where violence didn't matter as long as it was done to the savages. Savages had no right. In fact, you look at some US presidents, you look at European leaders talking about the savages of Africa and the savages of the Red Indians, that the principles of war do not apply to savages. Because savages do this, therefore they don't deserve those kind of rights. The King of Belgium was responsible for a massacre in Congo, for example. 10 million people who, some of them, just for the production of rubber. And if the quota was not met, the people's arms were cut off just to make sure that they fulfill the production of quota. So do we have confidence in human thought? Things are changing. There are people who have made observations that a war which can kill more than 10 million people is a matter which happens once in a century. And the longest term of peace has been about 78 years before big powers are not in conflict. So I am challenging the international order, the developing countries. I will come to the solutions for the developing countries later. It is very easy to be able to challenge it, but whether they will listen, that's a different story. Therefore, we'll be talking about individuals. We'll be talking about a new era in which world cooperation can take place, and the need for that. The need for that is not only the fact that we want peace. The need for that is other issues like global warming, the fact that social media, the fact that the world is being challenged by technological developments, and whether the systems are fossilized, whether the systems we have the flexibility, or whether we have to develop an understanding for newer systems. That's the thinking which we have to look at. There are 5 levels of causes which can be looked at, and all those levels are important. One is the individual level. The psychology of the head of state is always important, and the world focuses on psychology of this head of state. Sometimes it is a brutal reactive psychology, sometimes it is a very cooperative psychology, sometimes it's an isolationist psychology, sometimes it becomes very ethnic in the sense that we have to, this country, this race, this white race or black race or the Hindu race has to establish its strength in the world. So that's psychology of leaders. And I don't have to name leaders. You can, in all my descriptions, you can fit a leader in one of these descriptions, which leader I am talking about. So psychology of individuals matters. That's why the world looks at who's going to steer that country or this country, where, in which manner. Then there is a sub-state level of consultation, which is, for example, cabinets, parliaments, advisors within the government, and those are also important. The military establishment, for example, in some countries. All these are important factors, and these factors, the leadership at that level is also important. Pakistan today, unfortunately, is at a confusion at a number of levels. So what I talk about first is for the developing countries to look at, and at the same time, I have specific targets for my own country. That's how I start. That's how I start looking at it. In my thinking, there is always a circle of my concern, which is huge. My concern goes to global warming. My concern goes to many things. But as the President of Pakistan, for example, or beyond an individual, my concerns, there's a narrower circle of my influence. So I have to narrow down my concerns. As far as concerns are concerned, I can talk to you. I can verbalize our thoughts, but those are academic thoughts. But when I talk about the circle of influence, I mean the circle of influence of my parliaments, of our advisors, of our think tanks, of our leaders, therefore, and of the country, where we can influence. All of you are the circle of influence which can be charged to do what you want to do. Then The conflict is of state, of countries, their attitudes, and there's a momentum in states. There's a momentum, directional momentum of India, for example, for no peace attitude as far as Pakistan is concerned. So there's a momentum of states which has to be looked at. Then, as far as solutions are concerned, there's a bilateral level of trying to come to a solution. That's what we have been trying, to come to solutions on all our borders, everywhere. That's a bilateral level of solution. Bilateral level of cooperation, for example, with China, for example, with the United States of America. Those are, for example, with the European Union. Those are bilateral. For example, with Turkey, those are bilateral approaches of bilateral understanding. And then there comes the international system. And for this, I have a challenge that the international system today looks quite fossilized, not able to take charge of the changing dynamics of the world in a number of ways. The representation, the veto power, the fact that it becomes an agent of oppression. For example, the misinformation of the media I'm talking about is not new from the social media. It is continuing from the print media. For example, the weapons of mass destruction was given a cloak of United Nations resolutions, which continues. The resolutions got passed with different promises, and the way those resolutions work resisted peace in a number of manners. So we are learning from that also. We are learning from the fact that the superpowers, for example, allowed things in each other's domains to happen. And when they challenged each other, Syria went through a different cycle. When they didn't challenge each other, Iraq went through a different cycle. When they didn't challenge each other, Libya went through a different cycle. So these are the developing countries whose interests are stuck in the fact that for a time of 70 or 80 years, it was decided there are three directions of the global world order. One was trade, democracy, and human rights. And sometimes democracy and human rights were just used as a tool, not in fairness to all countries of the world. It was used as a tool that our guy may not have democracy, but we like him, so therefore we support him. And where democracies were imposed, for example, in Algeria, democratically elected government was not liked in other countries also. Let me not go into specifics because we are talking about principles. Specifics only where we need to communicate an example for the specific. So rivals, what rivals do? The rivals accumulate power, number one, and rivals accumulate the strength to reduce the power of your rival. Those are the two directions when there is rivalry in international relations at the bipolar level. So these pacifying forces, have lost their voice. It's vested interests which creep up now. There are no principles. I have hardly seen principles being used. If weapons of mass destruction as an argument can be used, similarly Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never existed, was used. Similarly, the destabilizing, which was decided that countries will not destabilize other countries or will not interfere with other countries, blatantly or covertly, that has happened throughout the last 60, 70 years, since after the Second World War. Does that make us comfortable? Does that tell us there's a new scenario which is available, which is very bright, and which we have to have hope on? But we must live with hope. We must make an effort with hope to challenge whatever is coming. But for that, there are other things may be necessary. I must say that the tragedy of great powers is that they look at regional strengths first, getting influence within the region, and then they go beyond the region. They maximize their wealth and they attain weapons superiority. So the direction of the world, very fairly to all of you, simplistic people, us, developing people, us, poor people, us, think of our ideals. We think of de-weaponization in the world. But there is no era which I remember which looked at de-weaponization seriously.
सदर ममलकत डॉक्टर आरिफ अलवी मागला डायलॉग के इख्तितामी सेशन से खिताब कर रहे थे। उन्होंने कहा कि दुनिया में तेजी से तब्दीलियां रूनुमा हो रही हैं, तनाज़ात के बायस दुनिया में तफरीक बढ़ रही है।
Different countries convince their own government towards a theory which I can only ridicule, which was mutually assured destruction. And the best of countries, which had a liberal thinking, which had hundreds and hundreds of think tanks and intelligent people, all of them subscribed to mutually assured destruction. And in one of my talks, I gave an estimate, and I looked for an estimate. I calculated how much it must have cost. So generally, I believe to the United States, it costs about $6 or $7 trillion for nuclear assuring mutually assured destruction in all their 6,000 or 30, whatever the number of nuclear weapons. And the same amount it cost the Soviet Union, $6 or $7 trillion. Imagine even $1 trillion can do for global warming. Imagine what $1 trillion would do for food security in the world. So what a waste it has been. So it is us, our thinking, when we can't get out of our national or whatever biases we have, when we distrust other people, that's what we do in personal lives, and that gets translated into the world stage. What we do in personal lives, we don't trust each other. For example, if you look at your own families, my own family, let me say, there are a number of conflicts in my own family. People have gone to court on inheritance, for example, number of conflicts. And there are phobias then. Okay, the other is doing this, therefore we have to react. So conflicts, phobias. The same is true between tribes within a country and between countries. Conflicts, phobias, love, hate relationship, it's part of our DNA. When we mix our DNA with the realities of the world and with the instruments we have, with anger, our reactions would be different. With a sword in our hand, our reaction would be different. When I was a student in Karachi, ex-Senator Javed Jabbar Sahab was my 2-year senior in school. When we were students in Karachi, the maximum you could think of were fist fights in college. Even those scared us. Then there came a Danda Bardar Tanzeem. That scared us further. Then there were pistols fired at Karachi University. Oh, that scared us much more. But then there was an automatic weapon being fired also. So conflicts, then individuals, nation states react to conflict with the maximum power they have. What's the reason of accumulating nuclear power, for example, at this huge cost? Something for the think tanks to consider. So my trust in the think tanks since then has reduced. Okay, now what can we think of? This concept has been challenged actually by a number of people throughout history have looked at these conflicts, look at these identity crises, starting from Socrates, who talked about not only trade and consultation, but thymos as a passion, and looking at, for example, Ibn Khaldun, who talked about the fact that asabiya will come down every few years, and it's a cycle where people will keep on changing. And then a period in the last 300 years where economists have come forward. Max Weber, for example, other economists have come forward with the work ethic, for example, talking about the fact that economy and liberalism and trade and democracy are the principles, and that's why Francis Fukuyama says the history has ended. That's the end of history. But then Samuel P. Huntington and others have gone back to the fact that there is a primordial urge to identify, to look at dignity of our nation, to look at those identities, and that the clash is in the world is still of a primordial nature. But that's for arguments. But I understand today that human nature is bound to be susceptible to human emotions. That's where someday artificial intelligence may work. But what broad interventions can we do? Now, coming back towards the solution as to what we can do. What broad interventions can we do? For example, international diplomacy can be a major tool in trying to prevent conflicts. But tools which are blunted by veto powers is an area which the world will have to look at. Not in the sense, and Pakistan has been claiming that, not in the sense that you give veto powers to other emerging nations, but get out of that concept of preferred nations having veto powers. Get out of that. Unless you do that, it won't happen. The other is the specific interventions. These are broad interventions I was talking about. I looked at specific interventions that could be at looking at chemical weapons, looking at nuclear weapons, look at specific radiological weapons and try and limit them. But what happens at the same time, the developed countries, when they curb some weaponry, actually at the same time they're looking at and developing higher weaponry. So all that talk does not make sense. You see that the nuclear non-proliferation, I agree, it's a good concept, but at the same time it tells me why can't responsible nations reduce or eliminate their nuclear arsenal. And there's a recent paper which has been written by the Future of Life Institute, and reading my own readings, I could pick up 5 or 6 near misses in the nuclear world, where just the fact one individual decided that this was a false news, he did not press the nuclear button. But I thought there were 5 or 6 near misses. This paper talks about 40 near misses where the world could have eliminated itself, at least in the present sense of the word. So that's one specific thing which can be done. But there are new emerging risks. New emerging risk is something in which a lot of work can be done. For example, the world is being challenged by the global warming. That opens up cooperation. The world is being challenged by epidemics like COVID. The world can cooperate in those areas. And the limitations of present elite countries acquiring more vaccines has been nakedly shown to the world today, that there is an elite response which the world has to look at. So therefore, with geoengineering, there is a possibility of reducing the amount of sunlight coming to the earth. That's a scare area where sulfate particles are actually sprayed by planes in a manner where volcanic ash used to reduce the temperature of the world in a similar manner to be able to launch sulfate particles in the air. And the effect of individual actions on neighboring countries can be devastating, and therefore it can lead to another conflict. Therefore, some things have to be looked at in that manner. And arms control is some area where things can work, but it has to be led by bigger powers. It's not from us when we say that arms control must take place. It doesn't happen that way. The fact that where do we go from here is something which I have about 8 possible solutions where we can work together. There's a possibility of nudging the giants. There's just a possibility. Throughout history, the smaller countries have had almost no role. But the more we talk about intelligence and intellect and principles, the more the possibility is that we can nudge the giants. But is there a forum to nudge the giants? Will individual countries have the voice to be able to do that? The fact that you always need an enemy, politicians have realized that. That's how they get votes. That's how they get a following. And if you look at the way movies have been made in the West and in the East, you will realize there always has to be one enemy to be looked at. For example, the Red Indians. For example, the Nazis For example, Russia itself, Soviet Union. So there has to be an enemy. And from transitioning from a Cold War scenario, remember the Cold War scenario was an ideological battle also. It was just not a regional or a power struggle. It was a left and right ideological battle. Today is just a battle of trade. So it's out of the ideological domain where thinking matters. It's a battle of vested interest and trade. And there are comparisons between different countries. I just saw a picture again, I saw it before also, that Zheng He, who was the admiral of the Chinese Navy, his ship as compared to the ship of Columbus is like a huge oil vessel in today's world, and the launches which we see in Karachi. It's a huge difference there. And then even then, Zheng He came to 7 trips towards the Cape of Good Hope, towards South Africa, and never in conflict except once passing through the Strait of Sri Lanka, but generally doing trade. So compared to the trend in Europe of going to the new world and establishing your domain and colonial territories and exploiting the resources, so that was a big difference between countries when we talk about. So improve, transform, remake international institutions to respond to the emerging threats. That is the United Nations. Improve, transform, or remake, because this is a fossilized situation where the old tools are being used. And in Pakistan today, when the old tools are being used for the new emerging technologies, we tend to just ban YouTube for a few years. So that means you should change your tools also. You don't know what to do, so you ban it. And you think that would work. Then third is my suggestions to this forum is the need for cooperation in global warming. Of course, that is emerging more and more, with the world realizing the impact and the fact that 1.5 degrees by warming by 2050 may not be attainable, but the fact that we have to look together at global warming, at emissions being created, at the fact that technologies like carbon sequestration have to be worked upon, the interference in like I mentioned, the spraying of sulfur in the air or creating rain, all these things are today probably irresponsibly also challenging the world, the weather. We don't realize what will do what. So therefore, there is a need for cooperation in all this. Then there's another dangerous aspect to which Pakistan is succumbing today, and that's countering fake news. It's a very dangerous aspect. It's like the old propaganda, it's like the old Gulf of Tonkin, it's like the old weapons of mass destruction. Very dangerous. And for this, we don't need international cooperation, we need our own moral insight into this. The world is facing that, not only Pakistan. But if a country can establish its strength in these areas where you don't fight for things which are being exaggerated or creating dissension within the community, so I think countering fake news, the world is a very important situation in the world where it has to be fought. The emerging AI and the cyberspace. Recently I read a survey, a very important survey on how global ranking, what is being done in the cyber world, and I am shocked by this tool as being one of the biggest tools today. The capability to ground all your aircraft, for example, in a situation of war, is a very strong possibility. You remember the Arab-Israeli war of 1967 when no planes, that was not cyber situation, but some information delivered to Israel to be able to paralyze the Egyptian Air Force right on the ground. So that cyber technology is a big threat. And the world, and imagine, we are talking about peace, and these instruments are developing at a very fast pace. So whether the countries which have the powers to develop new instruments, whether they are also concerned or it is us only. the smaller countries, the developing world, only we are concerned. If we are concerned, let me assure you there is not going to be much of a change unless you create your own importance. But with importance, if you come into hubris, that will then transform you also into the same kind of psyche. So that's very important to not to acquire that hubris. Also realize that there is emerging abundance in the future. I look at the possibilities of food, for example, and I learn, I want to make a statement, for example, Netherlands is the second biggest exporter of food in the world today, a small country, 19 times smaller than Pakistan. So that means there is a possibility of global hunger being handled by technology. The possibility that with cooperation we can handle that. So, Pakistan, for Pakistan, that's a direction as well. Pakistan is much more abundant as far as water is concerned, as far as land is concerned, and this new ability to do vertical farming is not a very new, very prohibitive technology. It is open, but it requires the leadership to do it. You see, a leadership which develops new uses for containers is appreciated, but at the same time, that's not the direction the country should adopt. So, I think we have emerging abundance, that's a possibility, if only related to cooperation. And a new global order is definitely essential. The global order away from vested interest, a global order based on morality. But as soon as I use the word morality, there are issues. Which morality? The Christian morality, the Islamic morality, what morality are you talking about? So I would rather say a human morality, understanding the value of life of a human, whether from whichever country he belongs, should have the same rights. As you approach that kind of morality, I think the world will be a different place. The sixth item I have, in which we could look at what the developing countries should react like, is bilateral conflict resolution. And that's very important. As far as Pakistan is concerned, as far as other countries are concerned, bilateral conflict resolution is important. Fight in this context also, the fighting insecurities with transparencies. You remember during the Cold War, when there were treaties of reduction of weapons, there was a transparency created in which you could look at what was being done. So unless there are transparencies, the world today does not trust anybody else. So the trust factor is missing, but an area can be determined where transparencies will become important. And then they abandon the concept of humane war. The war is never humane. The war is destructive. It's very costly as far as families are concerned, children are concerned, the misery. And when it happens closer to you, it becomes the talk of the town. For example, if it happens in Europe, in Ukraine, it becomes a very important thing. So therefore, the imagery of wars, what misery the entire Middle East went through, and as far as Libya, countries and people have gone through, I think war should be decided there should be no war rather than humane war. And let me then end. I have narrated this in the Parliament also. Let me end. But I realize that all this discussion, separating human psychology and doing only rational discussion, I don't think there's a solution, because scientists and philosophers have predicted, like Yuval Noah Harari as a philosopher and Stephen Hawking as a scientist, all have predicted that this DNA-based human race is 10,000 years of leadership is going to end, and the silicon-based race will take over. And that's a real threat. Let me tell you, that's a real threat. And I would advise you a few books like Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence is something to read about, and the dangers of artificial intelligence getting sentient is very much there, is there today. And we will overcome, we will understand that who was that scientist who had a Turing test, Alan Turing. his test was in sentience, that artificial intelligence or computers will become as sentient, was that in one room there would be a computer and the other room would be a human being, and this human being evaluating would be asking questions from the computer and from the human being. And if he gets confused, okay, who is the human being, that's the Turing test. That, with the technologies available today, for those who write, GPT-3, the writing instrument of Google, for those who understand AI, there's a lot of change which is happening. Those who understand computing power, the new Xanadu computer of 119 qubits is able to look at problems 120 million times faster than the fastest supercomputer in the world today. Problem solving, which the fastest supercomputer would take 9,000 years, these new computers are solving problems in 1 microsecond, which is 1,000th of a second. So there are huge challenges which are coming up from different directions. You need a few people with their hands on these tools to disrupt global balance of power. Few people with hands on to these instruments can disrupt global power. So with these, the last thing I wanted to mention was the fact that the human race will survive with only one concept, which has been propagated by Rumi very well, of love and compassion. And Rumi says, you love yourself first, so you understand the misery of others. To clean your heart, then you love your family, bring them in a loving situation up to people. Rumi has not defined this as his 7 steps. I have tried to figure it out what the Rumi said. So, so the second step is love your family, and the third step is love your neighbors. That's very important. Love your neighbors. It's an Islamic concept also, and it's true for individuals as well as of states. Love your neighbors. Then love your nation, but not at the cost of enmity with another nation. Love your nation. And the fifth is love humanity. Very important. Insaniyat. If you love humanity, you will not perpetuate wars the way we have been doing that. And the sixth concept is love all of God's creations, whether living or non-living. And when we talk about non-living, we did not understand the earth. We have a huge footprint on the earth. We thought earth will always give us immeasurable amount of goods. So we stopped loving the water, we stopped loving the earth. We are now at risk of those reactions. So that concept is very important, and that was spoken by Rumi a few hundred years ago. And Rumi, by the way, is the most sold poet in the United States. So I believe there's hope that way, starting from the bottom up. So then he says, love your prophet, and then he says, that's the only way to love God. So unless you have that kind of compassion, that kind of human morality, the world, I'm afraid, is going in a direction which is increasing conflicts, not reducing conflicts. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was always a pleasure to speak here and at Summit and other think tanks in which I'm losing confidence in general. Thank you.
सदर ममलकत डॉक्टर आरिफ अलवी मागला डायलॉग के इख्तितामी सेशन से खिताब कर रहे थे। उन्होंने कहा कि अक़वाम मुत्तहिदा के क़याम का मकसद आलमी अमन को यकीनी बनाना था, लेकिन गरीब मुल्कों का आज भी इस्तेसाल हो रहा है। ताकतवर मुल्कों का अलमिया इलाकाई असर रसूख, वसाइल पर कब्जा और हथियारों का हुसूल है। हमें हकीकत पसंद बनकर मामलात